So continuing my series looking at World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, it's now time to take a look at French World War II tanks. And despite France being knocked out of the war relatively early and most of the existing French tank designs already being in game, there are still a very large amount of French tanks that still need adding, as well as various tank destroyers, assault guns and anti-air vehicles. So this is probably going to be quite a long episode. So at the start of World War II, France had a very large tank force consisting of 3,025 tanks of various types, ranging from World War I era Renault FTs all the way to the modern Samura S35, and many smaller and larger tanks in between. However, in the lead up to the war, it was recognised that improvements could be made to the existing tanks, while entirely new tank designs would be needed to fend off the German threat. So we'll start off by looking at the new tanks being developed by France in the early part of the war, beginning with the AMX-38, which was a new light infantry tank design by AMX. Now, in order to examine the AMX-38, we need to look at the small infantry tanks that were already in service, because of course France already had a light infantry tank in the form of the R35, which quickly became the most numerous of French tanks in World War II, with 1,611 being produced. However, while the R35 was accepted and put into mass production, the military were so impressed by the FCM design, they ordered 100 examples of what would become the FCM-36. There were a few reasons for this, for example the use of a diesel engine which gave it nearly twice the range of the R35, as well as making it less likely to catch fire, and some other major features were the fact it used welded armour and had a turret that was considered superior to that on the R35, with plans made for it to replace the APXR turret of the R35, but its inability to accept the longer 37mm gun quickly killed this idea. Despite this and only 100 being built, the French army considered the FCM-36 the best of the infantry tanks in service, and its design would even go on to inspire the Soviet BT-SV tank, which in turn inspired the T-34, so this was a very influential design. The fact it used welded armour was also very important, because most French tanks used cast armour at this time, which it was hoped would lower production costs. However, in the summer of 1937, it was decided to test the armour of some R35s by firing on them, and it was worryingly found that the majority of 25mm shells penetrated the armour, while 14 out of 18 37mm shells also penetrated the armour, meaning that these tanks were highly vulnerable to existing German tank guns, and suggested that there might be some issues with the quality of the cast armour. Thus, when AMX started designing what would become the AMX-38, it was decided to use welded armour, with a maximum thickness of 40mm. Again, this is actually the same thickness as the R35, which you would think would give them the same effectiveness in-game, not taking into account angles. But in-game, cast armour actually has a 0.94 multiplier, meaning the R35's armour only offers 37.6mm of protection, while welded armour would give the full 40mm of protection, meaning the AMX-38 would already be slightly better protected off the bat in-game. The armament was also improved, with the longer SA-38 37mm gun being fitted, which is capable of penetrating 36mm at 500 metres, compared to the short SA-18 of the previous tanks, which could only penetrate 24mm, making the AMX-38 more useful against enemy tanks, while a 7.5mm machine gun is also carried for close-in defence. Speed was okay at 15.5 miles per hour or 25 kilometers an hour, certainly not the fastest tank in the world, but definitely not the slowest either, and it was good enough for the infantry support role that it was intended for. Unfortunately, like many other French tanks, only 2 crew members are carried, making it rather easy to knock out via crew losses. Unfortunately, before being put through testing, the original welded turret developed problems with cracks forming in the welds, showing some of the potential issues with welded armour, and requiring a new welded turret to be designed. So, with the turret replaced, the now 13.5 tonne prototype would be put through tests, and seems to have performed very well, but the requirements for the tank were then increased by General Keller, Inspector of the Armoured Forces, with the tank now required to have a 47mm SA-35 gun, and a maximum of 60mm of armour in order to deal with the newer German tanks. This new AMX-38 prototype was larger and heavier, weighing in at 16.5 tonnes, and now had 60mm of frontal armour, as well as a new turret to house the more powerful 47mm gun, which is capable of penetrating 47mm at 500 metres, while a more powerful engine is also carried, offsetting the increase in weight so it can maintain the same top speed. In War Thunder, I could see both prototypes being added, with the first prototype being a 1.0 tank like with the FCM36, while the second prototype, with its 47mm gun and thicker armour, could easily be added at 1.3 or 1.7, being a much bigger threat to enemy tanks compared to other French light tanks, and I think it would be a fun vehicle to have in game. In real life, the AMX-38 does seem to have been a good design, but never made it into service, despite the second prototype being built by December 1939. By this point, other companies had started to submit their own designs, with the last review of these being carried out on the 14th of May, so after the Battle of France had started. Despite the ongoing invasion, it was decided to wait a month to ensure that all designs had been submitted, by which point France had surrendered, bringing an end to the AMX-38 before it could even get started. Another tank that was being developed around this time was the Char G1, which was intended to be a new 20-ton medium infantry tank, though this weight limit was later increased to 35 tons. And designs were submitted by various companies, though only two would actually build prototypes, these being Renault and SEAM or SEAM. Renault's Char G1R design would have been a very advanced tank, with its armament being a turret-mounted 47mm gun or a length 32 75mm gun, but as it turns out only a hull was ready by June 1940 and no turret was ever finished. SEAM's Char G1P design, on the other hand, might be possible to add. Now, to start with, this only got a hull built, but this was done in 1936, allowing for testing to be carried out with a dummy turret, although it only used a 120 horsepower engine instead of the intended 280 horsepower engine. Due to this, it did badly in its first tests, with a top speed of only 8 miles per hour or 14 kilometers an hour. So the prototype was rebuilt and fitted with the intended 280 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engine. However, at this point, unlike Renault's design, it was also ordered that an APX-4 turret from the Char B1 bis be fitted, which doesn't seem to have happened, but because this was ordered in 1938, it's possible that the prototype was modified to fit it, meaning it might be technically possible to add this tank, as we of course have the stats for the hull and the turret. It was also intended to have a hull-mounted 75mm gun, though again this doesn't seem to have been fitted. Armour was pretty decent, at 57mm for the front, 35mm for the sides, and 35 or 40mm for the rear, while some sloping is also used, making this pretty well protected. Speed is a little bit hard to work out, as it was supposed to reach a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, which the first prototype obviously never reached, and while the second prototype does of course have the more powerful engine, additional weight added during the rebuild may have still resulted in a slower speed, though anything above 15 miles per hour or 25 kilometers an hour would be decent enough, I would think. Lastly, it was to have a crew of 4, a driver, gunner for the 75mm howitzer, commander in the turret, and a radio operator, so quite similar to the Char B1 bis. In-game, this would be a rather interesting tank, playing much like the Char B1 bis with similar armour and armament, but potentially being a bit faster, making this a bit easier to use on the battlefield, probably at a battle rating of 2.3 to 2.7, and it would be cool to see this rather unusual and forgotten French tank represented in-game. In real life, the specifications were changed to fit a turret-mounted 75mm gun, like in the Renault design, and SEAM was unable to afford building a new prototype, and the existing prototype was not suited to be redesigned in such a way, though they did try and install a new ARL-3 turret. But in September 1939, development work was halted, and the whole was relegated to a technology demonstrator. But it was still the nearest of the various Char G1 designs to being ready for mass production. So now that we've looked at the brand new designs, we can move on to existing tank designs that were planned to be upgraded by France. And we'll start with the Renault R40, or to give it its full name, Char Ligier Modèle 1935 R Modif 1939, which was an attempt to upgun and improve the Renault R35. The R35, as mentioned earlier, had been introduced as a replacement for the Renault FT, which was nearly 20 years old by this point, and quickly became the most produced French tank, with 1,611 being built by June 1940. Initially, the design was considered pretty good for a light infantry tank, having a maximum armour of 40mm, a short 37mm gun and coaxial machine gun, a top speed of 12.4 miles per hour or 20 km an hour, and a two-man crew. However, during early trials, a number of problems had quickly become apparent, the main one being with the suspension, which, while fine for driving on roads, suffered greatly when going cross-country. However, despite this issue, tanks were urgently needed, so production began regardless. It also became clear that the main armament was somewhat lacking, as while it was perfectly suited for dealing with enemy infantry, it was not suited for use against enemy tanks, so a better weapon would be needed. And then lastly, as mentioned earlier, some R35s were used in firing tests, involving 25mm and 37mm guns, and it was found that in many cases the cast armour was of poor quality, giving far less protection than it should have. In light of all of these issues, it was realised that a new tank would offer the best overall solution to these problems. For example, the AMX-38 we looked at earlier. But with continued production being a priority, it was also decided to alter the existing R35 design by fitting a new suspension, with the modified design due to go into production from the 1501st tank produced. A number of companies offered solutions, such as Lorraine and Toreno, but ultimately a suspension design by AMX was chosen, with this using 12 smaller road wheels, while an unditching tail was added to aid in crossing trenches. Even better news was that there was now enough longer 37mm SA-38 guns that they could be fitted as standard to the R40s, meaning that all R40s would fare much better against enemy tanks, while only some R35s were ever given this gun. So in real life this was a good improvement. Unfortunately in game we have an R35 variant that already has some of the features. For example, some R35s were given the longer 37mm gun, which the in-game version has, and it also has an unditching tail, so the only real difference would be the new suspension. However, due to this it should now perform a bit better when going cross-country, allowing it to move a bit quicker, and hopefully provide a slightly better firing platform when on the move. And while not the biggest upgrade, it would be nice to see this upgraded R35 in-game. In real life the R40 would go into production, but not until the 1541st tank in March 1940. But with the Battle of France starting in May 1940, and France falling in June 1940, only 130 to 155 R40s would be built. And while those that were built did serve successfully, there were far too few of them to make a major difference in the war. The Samura S35 was another tank that was slated to be put into production in an upgraded form as the S40, and like with the R40, the changes made would be evolutionary rather than revolutionary, with the chassis being lengthened, the height reduced, the frontal armour becoming a bit more sloped, the suspension strengthened, and a new 240 horsepower engine was to be installed, giving it a new top speed of 28 miles per hour or 45 km an hour, so about 3 miles per hour or 5 km an hour faster than the S35, while still having a 3-man crew. However, while the first 50 hulls were to use the APX-1 CE turret as used on the S35, from the 51st tank a new ARL-2C turret was to be installed. This turret would have the same armament and armour as the original, but was to be welded rather than cast, though the commander's cupola was still cast and made larger. Now the welded turret was supposed to increase the strength of the armour, in theory increasing the protection, which as mentioned earlier is modelled in War Thunder, so in-game the tank would be a little bit tougher to take down as a result. When it comes to adding the S40, we could in theory have two variants, the one with the original turret from the S35 and the one with the welded turret. That said, both would probably work at 1.3 along with the in-game S35, and could probably be folded with it if needed. And while not bringing massive changes to the game, it would be nice for these tanks to be available for French players, and to give players a glimpse of what sort of tanks might have been available in 1940 if things had gone a bit differently. As mentioned, the S40 with the original turret was to go into production from tank 451, which was slated to happen in June 1940, while the welded turret version was slated to start production in September 1940. However, S35 production was behind schedule, and with the invasion of France happening in May 1940, mass production of the first variant never started, and I don't think the welded turret was ever fitted to a hull, outside of a mock-up. That said, 4 hulls would be completed, showing how close these came to actually going into production. Though even if France had lasted a month or two longer, they still would have been built in very small numbers. Oddly enough, this isn't the end of the story, as after the occupation of France and the setting up of the fishy French government, there was a tentative agreement in the Protocols of Paris for 800 S-40s to be built by fishy France, 200 for use by France, 600 for Germany and Italy, and another 250 would then be built for Japan. But due to Hitler having an understandable scepticism of French rearmament, this never went into effect, and German occupation of fishy France in November 1942 killed the programme for good. The Char B1 bis was another tank that was slated to be upgraded. Indeed, we already have its intended successor in game as the Char B1R. However, there was a more modest improvement that was tested out in 1938 to 1939 on the Char B1 bis No. 234 Marseille, which was fitted with a new welded turret designed by FCM. The turret used seems to have been a simplified version of one of the turrets FCM had designed for its F4 design, which was a multi-turreted, super heavy design that never went beyond a paper design. But this would lead to the FCM F1, a 130-ton monster of a tank that actually had a wooden mock-up built by June 1940. Unlike with previous tanks, the reason for this turret being fitted doesn't seem to have been around enhancing protection, and more around testing a heavier turret, giving some practical experience with them, but it could also be potentially related to production issues. You see, while the hulls were produced by various firms, including FCM, all of these were then fitted with APX-4 turrets produced by APX. This could sometimes be a problem, as production delays of the turret often meant that the hulls would be finished with no turret to fit. Thus, by showing they could produce their own welded turrets at a faster rate, potentially FCM was hoping to be allowed to fit their Char B1 hulls with this new turret, though this doesn't seem to have actually occurred outside of this one case, assuming it was even a factor in the testing of the turret. The rest of the stats are exactly the same as the regular Char B1 bis, so I'd suggest placing it in a folder with the B1 bis at the same battle rating, giving players a good tank with potentially slightly more protection, and again showing players some potential French tank designs from the era. In real life, Marseille was the only Char B1 bis fitted with the turret, and at the start of the war, the turret was replaced by the usual APX-4 turret, while the tank itself would fight against the German invasion in 1940 before being captured on the 7th of June, having previously broken down, thus ending the story of this tank. Lastly, for upgraded tanks, we have the Char 2C Normandy, which was originally named Lorraine, but was renamed after an extensive up-armouring programme, with its frontal armour now coming in at 90mm thick, while the sides were 65mm thick, and a double roof was fitted to improve protection in this area. Now bear in mind the Char 2C's hull armour in-game is 45mm for the front and 22mm for the sides, and you can see what a massive upgrade this is to the armour, though unfortunately it increases the weight to 75 tonnes from 70 tonnes, which presumably slowed it down, though I've not seen any concrete figures on this. Other than that, the armament and crew remains the same. Placing this in War Thunder might be a bit problematic, as the current Char 2C is at rank 2 battle rating 2.3, and its 75mm gun can only penetrate 58mm at 500 metres with its 1916 APHE shell. However, there are a few shells that could help fix this issue. For example, the recently added Saint-Chamond uses the same Model 1897 gun and fires a Model 1910M APHE shell, which has 66mm penetration at 500 metres, giving it a slight increase in performance. Then we have the later 6.4kg Pequot 40, which was also able to be fired from the Model 1897 at a velocity of about 625 metres a second, which should give it a similar penetration to the M72 shell in game, with a penetration of 78mm at 500 metres. So these two shells would allow the Char 2C to be added at a higher battle rating, while still having a decent armament, probably at a battle rating of 4.0 or higher. In real life, like with the other Char 2C tanks, Normandy wouldn't actually see any service and ended up being scuttled by its crew when it was unable to be evacuated from advancing German forces. Of course, there are other types of vehicles from World War II that France still needs adding, such as armoured cars, tank destroyers and anti-air vehicles. And we'll look at the armoured cars first, starting off with the Gendron Samura AMR-39, which initially started off as an armoured car prototype built in 1934 by a Mr. Gendron, who seems to have been independent of the usual major manufacturers and designers of the time. This prototype looks fairly normal at the front, having two frontal wheels, but at the rear it has one set of wheels in a tail configuration. A rather odd choice, more reminiscent of some of the oddball World War I designs, like the Russian Tsar tank and the US steam-wheeled tank. Unsurprisingly, this first prototype had poor stability, so a second prototype was built to a more conventional layout, and while giving good results, Gendron was unable to put it into mass production. But luckily Samura stepped in to the story at this point, producing a third prototype, which was accepted into service and ordered for production. Looking at the third prototype, it was armed with a 25mm SA-35 gun, giving an in-game penetration of 56mm at 500m, while a 7.5mm coaxial machine gun is also carried, making this a decently armed vehicle. Meanwhile, the top speed is 43 mph or 69 km/h, making it ideal for scouting and allowing it to avoid most enemies in the open, which it will need to do as the armour is only a maximum of 15mm thick, making it extremely vulnerable, while its two-man crew will make it easy to knock out 5 crew losses. While in theory all of the prototypes could be added, I think Gaijin should focus on the actual production variant, and I could see this being a good 1.0 armoured car, having a decent armament and speed, and it would be nice to see this often forgotten armoured car in War Thunder. In real life, while 150 AMR-39s were ordered in September 1939, only 4 were ever built, meaning this vehicle never had any real effect on the war or vehicle development in general. The same cannot be said for the next armoured car, the Panhard AM-40P or Model 201, a rather unique looking armoured car that is an ancestor to the world famous Panhard EBR, with the prototype being ordered for development in 1938 and finished in 1939. One of the designers for the AM-40P was Louis Delagarde, who would later go on to develop the Panhard EBR of the 1950s, and a lot of design features that would be on that vehicle would get their start on the AM-40P. For example, the turret is an oscillating turret, where the whole turret elevates and depresses rather than just a gun, potentially allowing for greater degrees of elevation and depression, while like on the EBR, 8 wheels are used, with 4 of these being able to be lifted when on roads, making it a 4x4 vehicle, but these can then be lowered on rough terrain to make it an 8x8 vehicle, allowing it to get around the battlefield no matter the terrain. The actual armament carried in the turret is the 25mm SA-35, a decent weapon for a recon vehicle, while a 7.5mm machine gun is also carried, while plans were also made to fit a 37mm gun in the future. Unlike most other armoured cars, the armour is actually pretty good, maxing out at 60mm for the front while being sloped, meaning this can actually stand and fight against some enemies, giving them a bit of a surprise when they try to take out what looks like a vulnerable vehicle. That said, it should be avoiding these fights where possible, which is also helped by its small size. To top it off, it has a top speed of 50 mph or 80 km/h, both in forward and reverse, making this a very speedy vehicle, especially when combined with its 8x8 wheel arrangement when off-road, making this a brilliant scout vehicle and making it able to quickly cap points. Unfortunately, only 2 crew are carried, which does make it vulnerable when an enemy does penetrate the vehicle. I could see the AM-40P being added at a battle rating of 2.0 or higher, mainly on account of its armour and high speed, making this a rather useful scouting vehicle, and it would be nice for this cool and unique armoured car to be added in-game. In real life, the AM-40P was ordered into production, with 600 being ordered. Unfortunately, this was in May 1940, and with the invasion of France occurring in this month, this never ended up actually going into production. But the vehicle was successfully evacuated to French North Africa, where it seems to have ultimately disappeared, though its design would lead to the far more famous Panhard EBR, allowing it to live on in a sense. So, with much of France now occupied or under control of the Vichy French puppet state, armoured development was mostly halted, at least officially, with existing French tanks rapidly becoming obsolete as the war progressed. To make things worse, the new Vichy French Armistice Army was restricted from having tanks, and its Panhard 178 armoured cars had their 25mm guns removed, as well as the mantlets to prevent them being rearmed later on. However, a clandestine effort was begun by an organisation within the Armistice Army, the CDM, or Camouflage du Matériel, to set about hiding weapons from the Germans, so that they could be used in the event of a German invasion of Vichy France. They also worked with Joseph Brestany, who had previously designed a Panhard turret with a 47mm gun, which is in-game as an event vehicle, to design a new Panhard turret that could be fitted to existing Panhard hulls and armed with either 25mm or 47mm guns, becoming the CDM. The new turret is similar to the event Panhard turret, being extremely sloped at the front, which greatly improves the protection of the vehicle, and potentially players could choose whether to use the 25mm or 47mm gun, with both weapons having advantages over the other, the 25mm performing better against flat surfaces, while the 47mm gun is better against sloped armour and has a larger shell for post-penetration damage. A coaxial machine gun is also sometimes carried to the right of the gun, which does somewhat negate the protection as it is placed in a unsloped boxy superstructure, but does provide close-in defence against soft-skin vehicles. The rest of the stats should be the same as the regular Panhard 178, and I could see us doing well at a better rating of 1.3 to 1.7 depending on which weapon is used, and it would be nice for this somewhat unknown French armoured car to see some use in War Thunder. In real life, the turrets were distributed to various Armistice Army units, ready to be used in the event of a German invasion of Vichy France, the hope being that they could hold off the Germans until Allied forces were able to intervene. As it turns out, however, when the German invasion came after Operation Torch, the Armistice Army was ordered to remain in its barracks and was subsequently disarmed, with some of the Panhard CDMs falling into German hands or being hidden until France's liberation. So with all of France now completely occupied, there was no chances of producing armoured vehicles until after its liberation, and new designs would now be needed as existing French tanks were by now hopelessly obsolete. However, one design that was considered good enough to put back into production was the Panhard 178, as a new upgraded variant named the Panhard 178B, which was quickly designed with a new turret, upgraded armament and new engine. The new turret was the FL1, a large cylindrical turret that it had been hoped to fit with a new 75mm howitzer, but was ultimately armed with the 47mm SA-35 gun, while a coaxial machine gun was also mounted. The new engine should have about the same performance or maybe a little better than the existing Panhard 178s, giving a top speed of at least 44 miles per hour or 70 kilometers an hour, or perhaps a little faster, making this a very quick scouting vehicle. The rest of the stats should be broadly the same, with the crew being 4 and the armour maxing out at 26mm, making this rather easy to penetrate. I think this would work well at 1.7, being a fast vehicle and having a very hard-hitting gun, and it would be nice for this lesser-known armoured car to be added. In real life, about 414 of these vehicles were made, with these serving in France and its various colonies up until 1964, though by then armoured cars like the Panhard EBR would have long eclipsed it in usefulness. Moving on from the armoured cars, we now come to the French tank destroyers, and we'll start off by looking at the ARL V39, a tank destroyer that looks somewhat similar to the already in-game Samura Sal 40, which was its main competitor. The V39 came about in 1935 as a response to a requirement for a new self-propelled gun, with a vehicle made of soft steel finished in 1938 and a second prototype being produced sometime after. And after trials in 1939, 48 were ordered, plus 24 unarmed command variants, so 72 in total. The V39 was armed with a 75mm APX gun in the hull, which has an in-game penetration of 66mm at 500 metres, and to top this off it uses an APHE shell, making this a very deadly weapon. Like the Sal 40, a turret was fitted, which housed a 7.5mm machine gun for all-around defence against soft-skin vehicles. Armour was also pretty good, being 50mm thick for the front, 30mm for the sides and 40mm for the rear, while the turret maxes out at around 38 to 40mm, making this a little bit better protected than the SAL 40. Speed is also pretty good, with a top speed of 26 mph or 42 km/h, again faster than the SAL 40, while having a more powerful engine, more gears, and only weighing 1 tonne more, meaning this should be a decently mobile tank destroyer. Lastly, it had a crew of 5, with the driver also acting as the gunner, the commander being in the turret, and the rest being radio operators, loaders, or doing other jobs related to the gun. This seems like it could be a decent tank destroyer at 2.0 to 2.3, maybe between the SAL 40 and M4A 3105, as it has better armour and mobility, and potentially could have its armament slightly improved if given access to the Pequot 40 shell, allowing this to deal with enemy tanks a little bit better. In real life, the initial order was increased to 108, but like with many other tanks we've looked at today, this never occurred due to the fall of France. Also, like other vehicles we've looked at, these were evacuated to North Africa, and also like other vehicles, seems to have promptly disappeared, bringing their history to an end. After the German invasion of France, there would be some hurried attempts to get more vehicles out in the field, including tank destroyers, which brings us to the Lafley W15 TCC, which was a Lafley W15 truck fitted with a 47mm SA-37 gun at the rear. This design actually started in late 1939, and was originally fully armoured, with trials carried out in March 1940, leading to its adoption by the army. However, after the German invasion, it was decided to put it straight into production, and to get them out as quickly as possible, so much of the armour was removed, though the driver's cab was still armoured, and a large gun shield was carried, though the armour only maxed out at 15mm anyway, so it was only really good for against machine guns. The 47mm gun is the same as carried by the Lorraine 37L, giving it an in-game penetration of 89mm at 500 metres, making this a very effective weapon, though the fact it's mounted at the rear of the truck does limit its effectiveness somewhat, meaning you should really already be in position before engaging enemies as you can't fire forwards. Though on the bright side, it does mean you can quickly drive away after starting any fights. Meanwhile, the top speed is about 30 mph or 40 km/h, so decent enough for getting around the battlefield, and a crew of 4 is carried, 1 driver and the commander, gunner and loader for the gun. I think the W15 TCC could work well at 1.3 to 1.7, probably folded with the Lorraine 37L, as it has a decent speed, okay protection and a very good gun, making this an excellent tank destroyer, while the fully armoured prototype could possibly be added as an event or premium vehicle. In real life, these vehicles seem to have been pretty successful when deployed, but this didn't happen until early June 1940, by which point things were far too gone for these vehicles to salvage the overall situation. So despite some promising successes, they ultimately failed to change the course of the battle, and France was soon lost. It should be noted there was also another Lafley variant with a front-facing 25mm gun, which could also be added and would make it a good early tier tank destroyer, especially since it doesn't have the drawback of a rear-facing gun. So France may have now fallen to the Germans, severely limiting tank development, but Free French forces in the UK were still able to make some improvised vehicles in decent numbers, one of these being the Conus gun, named after its creator Adrian Conus, which is basically a Ford truck with a Model 1897 mounted to the back that was used to great effect by Free French forces in North Africa. It would be unarmoured aside from the gun shield, making it vulnerable to enemy fire, and the main gun would be rear-facing. But the Model 1897 hits pretty hard, and has an APHE shell with 58mm penetration at 500 metres, so it should do pretty well, with the truck presumably having a decent speed on road, though maybe suffering when going cross-country, while the crew count seems to be about 4 to 5. It should also be noted that a German 50mm gun was also mounted in at least one case, which could also be a good variant to add. I could see this being added at 1.3 to 1.7, maybe folded with the Lafley or Lorraine 37L, and it would be a good hard-hitting tank destroyer for France in the early tiers. There were also a few experimental vehicles produced in the UK by Free French forces, with at least 2 unique tank destroyers being produced. One of these being a Renault UE tractor armed with a British 57mm 6-pounder gun, and another being a Lorraine 37L tractor armed with the 17-pounder gun. And both of these seem to have some weird muzzle brakes added to them, though I'm not sure if that's going to make any difference to the guns. Both vehicles were very lightly armoured, with a maximum of 9mm of armour, plus what looks like a mostly enclosed gun shield for the crews, making them pretty vulnerable to enemy fire, but in return they pack a massive punch, with the 57mm gun having a penetration of 82mm at 500 metres with its stock AP round, depending on what variant of the 6-pounder is used, and 155mm at the same distance for the 17-pounder's AP round, making both of these guns very deadly for enemies over a range of battle ratings. Both vehicles have decent if not spectacular top speeds, the Renault UEs being 19 mph or 30 km/h, and the Lorraines being 22 mph or 35 km/h. But this was before adding the guns, so it's likely they will be a little less mobile than in their original configuration. Lastly, the crew count is unknown, but I suspect a minimum of 4, 1 driver and 3 crew for the guns themselves. The 57mm armed vehicle could be added at 2.7 to 3.0, while the 17-pounder vehicle could be added at 3.0, with these vehicles giving French players access to some rather deadly vehicles that retain some French elements to them, especially since most French tank destroyers at rank 2 or 3 are American, and it would be nice for these improvised vehicles to be added in some form. In real life, it seems only one of each example was made, possibly as a technology demonstrator, or blueprint for some potential future conversions. But either way, it seems they didn't see any combat and were probably reconverted back into artillery tractors at some point. So now we come to French anti-air vehicles, and we have a few examples here for France, such as this anti-air vehicle with a single 25mm Hotchkiss gun. There isn't much information on this, but I suspect a crew of 4, a decent on-road speed, and limited to no armour, while due to being fed by 15-round box magazines it might suffer in prolonged engagements. But it could work at tier 1 after the P70AA, or it could be folded with it. There are also quite a few anti-air vehicles like the Berlier VPR-2, which is armed with 2 13mm Hotchkiss machine guns on an unarmoured vehicle, and I think they would work at battle rating 1.0, though these type of vehicles would play much like the existing P70AA. However, there are some more deadly examples that were built just after World War II, but used World War II era components. Starting with this quad 20mm Flak 38 AA gun mounted on the back of a truck, which made sense to use as an anti-air weapon, as France now had access to vast quantities of surrendered German equipment after the war. The 20mm would have limited anti-armour capabilities, but will be lethal against enemy aircraft at short ranges, and should be able to move about quickly on roads, while having probably a crew of 4 and no armour, making it a vulnerable vehicle. I could see this being added at 3.7, giving French players a very effective anti-air vehicle for rank 3 and showcasing for some French uses of captured equipment. After this we have the Samura MCG AB140, which is a French half-track with quad Hispano HS404 cannons mounted at the rear, similar to the Israeli TCM-20 which has twin cannons. The vehicle itself is not the fastest, having a top speed of 22 mph or 36 km/h, so a bit slower than the P70AA, and it seems mostly unarmoured except for around the firing platform. But the armament should be pretty lethal against most enemy aircraft, while the crew is again probably about 4, and this would work well at 4.3 to 4.7, again giving French players access to a good alternative to the current slower firing French anti-air vehicles at rank 2 and 3. Lastly, we have the CCKW 353 P512, which is a French truck with 4 German 20mm MG151s mounted at the rear, and as you can see it would be unarmoured, but would pack quite a punch against enemy aircraft at short ranges, being able to put up a large amount of fire in a short amount of time to deal with air attacks. Of course, being mounted on a truck might not be the best when going cross-country, but it should have a decent speed on roads, and again probably a crew of 4, and they will be vulnerable due to a lack of armour. I could see this being added somewhere between 3.3 and 4.0, filling in the gap between the VTT DCA and the AMX-13 DCA-40, and giving French players yet another excellent anti-air vehicle for rank 3, and I could see this being used over the DCA-40 by many French players due to its rapid-fire weapons. So coming towards the end of the episode, and as you can see France was on the cusp of introducing quite a few effective tank designs right before the occupation of France. And if things had gone on for just a few months longer, it's possible we might have seen some of these entering service with the French army. But unfortunately, France ran out of time for these vehicles, and so most of them didn't enter production. And of course, with the occupation of France, most tank development did halt, though some clandestine work did carry on in Vichy France and abroad. For example, the 75mm SA-44 gun, as used on the ARL-44 prototype, was originally designed to be fitted in the SARL-42, which was a tank design in Vichy France that never went beyond drawings. So that brings us to the end of this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on these vehicles and any other vehicles you'd like me to cover in the comments below. I will probably be covering British World War II tanks in the next episode, which I expect to be quite a lengthy episode again, so hopefully you're looking forward to that. Anyway, I've been Toreno, and I'll see you next time.